The broken wagon shackle sank straight through Mara Keene's stew. Grease hissed, beans splashed her apron. Around the fire, 22 freight men stopped chewing. Silas Rusk stood over the pot with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "If you want a man's pay," he said, "fix a man's problem." Mara looked down at the black piece of iron lying among the beans. One side of the shackle had snapped clean through. The break was pale and grainy, almost silver in the firelight. She did not look at Silas. She reached into the pot with the long spoon, lifted the iron out and set it on the wagon tongue beside her. Then she said very calmly, "That didn't break today." A few men smirked. Silas did not. Mara wiped stew from her wrist. It was hammered cold. "The metal's been cracked for weeks. Check the left rear coupling on wagon 6. If the other half was made by the same smith, it will shear before noon tomorrow." Silas laughed because he had an audience and did not know what else to do with one. "Listen to her," he said. 3 days on the trail and she's inspecting iron." Across the camp, Abel Hart set down his tin cup. He was the owner of the outfit, though he never dressed like one. No fine coat, no polished boots. Just a dark wool shirt, a weathered hat, and the stillness of a man who spent more time making decisions than explaining them. He crossed the fire without hurrying. Silas saw him coming and straightened. Abel looked at the stew dripping from Mara's apron. Then he looked at the shackle. "Pick it up," he said. Silas blinked. "The iron, the beans." A small silence opened. Abel pointed to the dirt where the stew had splashed. "Every bit you knocked out of that pot comes out of your portion tonight." Silas's face tightened. "I was making a point. So am I." No one laughed now. Silas crouched and began gathering what could not be gathered. Abel turned to Mara. "How sure are you about wagon 6? Sure enough to unload it before morning?" "Why?" She touched the broken edge with one finger. Bad grain, cold shut near the eye. Whoever made this wanted it fast more than he wanted it sound. Abel watched her for a moment. "You were hired to cook." "I was hired because Mr. Pritchard said you needed someone who could cook." "That isn't what I asked." Mara met his eyes. "My father kept a forge outside Council Grove. My husband built freight wheels until a boiler burst took him and half the shop with it." There was no tremor in her voice. She had learned to say that sentence without one. Abel nodded once. "Wagon 6 gets unloaded." Silas stood, dirt and beans on his hands. On her word, Abel did not even turn toward him. "On mine." At 11 the next morning, the second coupling on wagon 6 split clean through while it was lying on the ground beside the road. If the wagon had still been loaded, 2,000 pounds of seed grain would have rolled down a limestone cut and taken the wheel team with it. No one laughed at Mara after that, not for a while. It was April of 1886, and the Hart Freight Company was moving 14 wagons from eastern Kansas to a string of settlements north of the Yellowstone. 740 miles, give or take the roads that washed out and the rivers that refused to stay where maps put them. The loads were ordinary things until someone needed them. Seed wheat, lamp oil, horseshoe nails, barbed wire, bolts of cloth, 2 cast iron stoves, a crate of school slates, 3 cases of quinine and fever powder packed in sawdust for a mountain doctor who had sent 3 letters marked urgent. 48 mules pulled the train. 23 men kept it moving, and Mara Keene, 24 years old, widowed 11 months, carried $18 in her pocket and a contract that paid 14 more every month she stayed. She had not joined because she wanted adventure. Adventure was what people called danger after they survived it. She joined because the landlord in Junction City had given her 10 days to clear the room she and Caleb had rented above the wheel shop. The company that owned the boiler called the explosion an act of providence and paid nothing. The church ladies brought food until their own kitchens became expensive. The wheelwrights who had worked beside her husband offered sympathy, but not employment. They knew she could set spokes. They knew she could true a rim. They knew she could judge an axle by sound. But knowing a widow could do a thing and being willing to pay her to do it were separate matters. So when Nathan Pritchard, an old customer of her father's, told her Abel Hart's freight outfit needed a camp cook, Mara packed her knives, 2 dresses, Caleb's small cross-peen hammer and the blacksmith tongs her father had given her at 16. She left behind the rest. The first morning on the road, she discovered the flour had weevils. The second, she found 6 pounds of bacon gone rancid. The third, Silas threw iron into her stew. By the fourth, she had sorted the flour, cut the bad fat from the bacon, reorganized the supply wagon, and marked every crate that could not survive water. She did not announce any of this. Men who had never been hungry believed food appeared because someone had purchased it. Men who had never lost a house believed shelter was a natural condition. Mara had learned otherwise. She rose at 4 each morning before the mule skinners began cursing the harness. She lit the fire with shavings kept under an oilcloth. She boiled coffee, mixed biscuits, and listened to the camp wake by layers. First the animals, then leather, then boots, then men. Abel Hart usually arrived between the coffee and the biscuits. At first, he took his cup and left. On the 6th morning he stayed. He stood on the other side of the fire while dawn thinned the darkness over the prairie. "Wagon 6 would have gone over," he said. Mara turned a biscuit in the Dutch oven. "Yes. You knew from one break. I knew enough to look. That's not the same thing." "No," she said, "it isn't." He drank his coffee. Up close, Abel looked older than she had first guessed. Not old, 40 perhaps. The years sat mostly around his eyes, where weather and worry had carved the same fine lines. His beard was trimmed with a knife rather than a mirror. A narrow white scar crossed the knuckle of his right hand. "You see anything else wrong?" he asked. "With the outfit? With anything made of wood, iron, leather, or poor judgment?" Mara glanced toward the sleeping camp. "That last category may take all morning." A sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh. More like he had forgotten one was possible and discovered it by accident. Then he said, "Walk the wagons after breakfast. Tell me what you find." "What about the cooking? I'll put 2 men on washing pans. They'll do it badly. Then teach them." "I wasn't hired to teach freight men how to wash grease." "No," Abel said. "You were hired to keep this outfit moving." "I'm beginning to think Pritchard neglected to explain how many ways you can do that." He walked away before she could answer. Mara watched him cross the pale grass toward the wagons. Then she looked back at the biscuits and told herself that being noticed was not the same as being safe. She had made that mistake before. Not with Caleb. Caleb had been kind. But kindness had not stopped a boiler from splitting. Love had not kept a roof over her head after the funeral. A good man could disappear in one white burst of steam, and every promise he made could vanish with him. She had no intention of building her future on another man's attention. She built it instead on things she could test: iron, wood, flour, weather, work. After breakfast, she walked the freight train with a piece of chalk. She marked a warped wheel spoke on Wagon 2, a cracked hame strap on Wagon 5, a loose brake block on Wagon 8. A box of lamp chimneys packed beside a crate of horseshoe nails, which meant half the glass would be powder by Nebraska. She found a split in the reach pole under Wagon 11 and lay in the dirt to see how far it ran. When she slid back out, Abel was standing above her. "Bad?" he asked. "Not yet. That sounds expensive. It becomes expensive if we wait." She got to her feet and wiped dust from her skirt. "We need an iron fish plate, 2 bolts, and a drill. There's strap stock in the repair wagon." "Can you make it?" "Yes." "Then make it." Silas Rusk was close enough to hear. He spat into the grass. "She's going to cook and smith now?" Mara did not look at him. Abel did. "You worried she'll take your position?" Silas smiled without humor. "I know my position good." "Then stand in it and hit your team." Silas walked away. Mara crouched beside the broken reach pole and measured the split with her thumb. "What did he do before this outfit?" she asked. "Silas?" "Yes. Drove our wagons in Colorado. Lost 2 teams in one winter and blames the mountain. Mountains are convenient that way." Abel looked at her. "Convenient?" "They don't argue when men put their mistakes on them." For the second time, that almost law moved through his face. By noon, Mara had the portable forge set behind the repair wagon. It was not much of a forge: a shallow iron pan, a hand bellows, a small anvil bolted to an oak stump. But fire did not care whether it lived in a brick hearth or a traveling box. Given air, coal, and attention, it would do the same work. The men gathered without admitting they were gathering. Mara heated the strap iron to orange. She did not swing the hammer like her father had. He had been broad through the shoulders and could move metal with brute weight when he chose. Mara worked closer, shorter strokes, cleaner placement. She made the heat do more of the labor. The iron flattened, curved, accepted the holes she punched. When she quenched the plate, steam lifted around her hands. For 1 second, the smell took her back to Caleb's shop. Hot scale, wet iron, pine shavings. Then came the other smell: boiler water, burned wool. The memory struck so hard her fingers tightened around the tongs. She saw the white wall of steam again, heard men shouting her husband's name into a room where no one could see. Mara set the tongs down before her hand shook enough for someone to notice. Abel noticed anyway. He did not ask. He stepped between her and the watching men and said, "Rusk." Bring the drill. The moment passed because he gave it somewhere else to go. Mara was grateful and resented the gratitude. Both feelings stayed with her for the rest of the day. By the end of the first week, the outfit had stopped calling her cook. Not everyone used Mara. Some said Mrs. Keene. A few said Mom, with the uneasy respect of men who had watched her repair something they had been preparing to lose. Silas said nothing unless he had to. That suited her. She divided her days between the fire and the wagons. Two younger teamsters, Owen Bell and Tomas Ruiz, learned to scrub pans because Abel made it clear that eating depended on cooperation. Mara taught them to rinse flour paste before it hardened and to turn the Dutch ovens upside down near the coals so they dried instead of rusted. Owen complained twice, Tomas only once. By the second week, they could produce coffee without poisoning anyone. Mara inspected wheels during the noon halt. She carried a small hammer and tapped the rims, listening for the dull note that meant a loose tire. She ran her palm over hubs for heat. She checked linchpins and chain hooks. Every evening, she wrote the day's problems in a school ledger she had taken from a damaged crate with Abel's permission. Wagon 3, right front hub warming. Wagon 7, mule Ned favoring left shoulder. 2 sacks flour damp at lower seam. Lamp oil crate shifted 3 inches. It was not beautiful work. That was one reason she trusted it. Beauty could lie. A polished wheel might hide dry rot. A smiling man might owe half the county. A clear sky might carry hail by supper. But a ledger kept the shape of what had actually happened. Abel began reading it after dark. He never asked to take it. He sat at the corner of the supply wagon while Mara finished inventory, and she turned the book toward him when she was ready. The first time he studied 3 pages without speaking. "You write down the mules," he said. "Mules break before wagons do. The skinners are supposed to watch them. Skinners watch whether an animal pulls. I watch how long it will." He looked at the note about Ned's shoulder. "What do you recommend? Switch him out for 2 days, pad the collar. If you keep him in the left lead, he'll open a sore. Then you lose him for 2 weeks instead." Abel closed the ledger. "Do it. You own the mules, and you notice the shoulder." That was how decisions worked between them after that. No speeches, no ceremony. She saw something. He asked what it meant. If her answer held, he acted. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than praise would have. Praise could be given by anyone. Trust had weight. On the 12th day, they reached the Platte under a sky the color of pewter. The river was not high enough to stop them. It was high enough to punish mistakes. Abel rode the bank for nearly an hour, searching for the least dangerous crossing. The men walked the teams through in pairs. Water climbed above the wheel hubs. The mules leaned into their collars, ears flat, while current shoved at the wagon beds. Mara waited on the near bank with the medicine wagon. The 3 quinine cases were packed beneath canvas in the center, but she did not trust canvas once water found a seam. She had Owen and Tomas lift the cases onto grain sacks, then wrapped them in oilcloth and tied the corners above the load. Silas watched from his saddle. "You think the river's coming into the wagon bed? I think rivers don't read freight manifests." He smiled thinly. "You think you're clever. No, I think the medicine stays dry whether I am or not." He leaned down from the saddle. "Hart's letting you speak too much." Mara tied the final knot. "Then you should complain to Hart." Silas's expression changed. Men like him preferred resistance when it came with fear. Anger gave them something to fight. Calm gave them nowhere to put themselves. He rode away. The medicine wagon entered the river last. Halfway across, the right rear mule lost footing. The team lurched. Water slapped over the tailboard. One wheel dropped into a hole, and the wagon tilted so sharply the upper crates shifted with a wooden crash. Mara was in the bed before anyone could stop her. She climbed across the load on hands and knees, cut one rope, hauled the heaviest crate uphill, and shouted for the driver to hold the team straight. The wagon rocked. Cold water poured over her boots. For one breath she saw the whole load sliding toward the river. Then the left wheel found stone. The wagon rose. The mules lunged. They came out the far bank shaking and wide-eyed but upright. Abel reached the wagon as Mara climbed down. Her skirt was soaked to the knee. A splinter had opened the side of her palm. She was breathing too fast and trying not to show it. "Medicine?" he asked. "Dry, you? Wet?" He looked at the blood on her hand. That wasn't the question. "It's a splinter, Mara." The use of her name stopped her, not because it was intimate, because it was exact. She looked at him. "I'm all right," she said. Then, before he could answer, "Not untouched, all right." His face eased slightly. "Good distinction." He pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and held it out. She took it. Behind him, the freight men were checking wheels and harness. No one made much of what she had done. On the trail, danger became ordinary quickly because there was always another practical thing waiting. Still that night, Tomas set a cup of coffee beside her ledger before she asked. Owen brought extra wood, and someone had moved the medicine cases away from the damp side of the wagon and placed fresh sacks under them. No one claimed it. Mara did not ask. The road turned north and west. The open prairie gave way to broken country, long swells of grass cut by creeks and low bluffs. Spring came unevenly. One afternoon was warm enough for shirt sleeves. The next morning, water froze in the buckets. Mara learned the outfit's sounds: the squeak of Wagon 9's brake lever, the cough of an older mule named Bishop, the light whistle Abel used when he wanted the lead team to slow without alarming the rest. She also learned the sounds that belonged to him: his boots near the fire before dawn, the small click when he set his cup on a rock, the silence that meant he was thinking, which was different from the silence that meant he was angry. He asked questions in the mornings. Not many. Enough. One day he asked why she carried a hammer in her apron. "My father gave it to me." "Is that the one you used at the forge?" "No, that one belongs to the company." "What's this one for?" "Remembering the difference." "Between what?" Mara turned the hammer in her hand. The head was small, black and worn smooth at the edges by 3 generations of use. "Between what people let you do and what you actually know how to do." Abel considered that. "My daughter would like you." The sentence came without warning. Mara looked up. "You have a daughter?" "2 children. Ruth is 11. Ben is 8. "Where are they?" "My brother's place outside Livingston." He looked toward the line of wagons. "Their mother died 4 years ago." Mara waited. Grief had taught her not to fill another person's pause simply because she could feel it. Abel continued. "Ruth remembers everything about her. Ben remembers pieces and gets angry when the pieces don't match what Ruth tells him." "What does he get angry at?" "Doors, horses, me, arithmetic. That is a wide campaign. Again, the almost law. He's thorough. And Ruth runs the house like a widow twice her age. She checks the pantry, corrects my brother's accounts, and lies when she's tired." Mara understood that child immediately. She thinks usefulness makes her harder to lose. Abel's eyes shifted to her. The fire cracked between them. "Does it?" he asked. Mara looked down at the dough in her hands. "No, but sometimes it is the only bargain a person knows how to make." He said nothing after that. He did not need to. The first real storm found them in western Nebraska. Mara smelled it in the afternoon. Metal and dust under the warmer air. The clouds were building behind them in green-black layers. The mules grew restless. Swallows flew low over the road. She told Abel at the noon halt. "Hail," she said, "and wind before it." "How long?" 2 hours, maybe less." He looked west. The horizon was still bright. Silas, within earshot, shook his head. "There's no storm." Mara watched a line of ants carrying eggs toward higher ground beside the wagon rut. "There is." Abel gave orders before Silas finished smiling. They pulled the wagons into a broken circle on a slight rise. Canvas covers were tightened. Animals were moved inside the windbreak. Mara had the lamp oil double-lashed and the medicine cases lowered to the wagon floor. She opened the repair wagon and pulled out every scrap of heavy canvas. "What are you doing?" Owen asked. "Protecting the mules' heads from rain, from hailstones." He looked at the bright edge of the sky. "You sure?" "No," she said. "That's why we prepare before certainty." The wind arrived all at once. It hit the wagon circle broadside, carrying dirt so thick the day turned brown. Men shouted. Mules kicked against traces. One canvas ripped free and flew like a sail until Tomas caught the rope around his forearm and was dragged 10 feet. Then the hail came. Not pebbles. White stones the size of walnuts hammered the wagon tops, shattered one of the remaining lamp chimneys, and drove men under axles. Mara crawled beneath the medicine wagon with Owen and 2 folded canvases. They worked down the line, throwing protection over the most panicked teams, tying cloth around blinders and ears. A mule reared. The lead chain snapped taut. Mara saw the hook begin to straighten. "Back," she shouted. Owen did not hear. She seized his coat and dragged him sideways as the hook tore loose and whipped through the space where his face had been. The iron struck the wagon wheel with a crack. Owen landed on top of her. For a second neither moved. Then he rolled away, white around the mouth. "That would have—" "Yes, I didn't see it. I know." They tied the line with rope and crawled to the next team. The storm lasted 33 minutes. It left 2 split canvas covers, 1 broken bow, 3 injured mules, 6 men bleeding from the scalp, and the ground white under a spring sky. The fire was gone. Every piece of wood in camp was soaked, except the box beneath Mara's supply wagon. She had lined it with waxed cloth after the Platte crossing. Inside were dry shavings, twists of newspaper, and 12 pieces of cedar she had been saving one by one. She built the first flame inside a cast-iron skillet with a sheet of tin shielding the wind. The men returned in groups, bruised and wet, and carrying the stunned expressions of people who had just been struck by weather from every direction. Mara gave them coffee, then broth, then strips of bacon fried hard because hot salt mattered more than elegance. She worked with a swelling bruise along her ribs where Owen had landed. Every time she bent, pain tightened around her side. She did not mention it. Abel came to the fire after checking the animals. Blood ran from a cut near his hairline. Mara pointed to an overturned crate. "Sit. I'm fine." "That answer is becoming crowded." He sat. She cleaned the cut with boiled water and a strip of linen. He held still while she worked. "You saved Bell," he said. "The chain missed him. Because you moved him. He was standing in the wrong place." "So were you." She tied the bandage. Yes, their faces were close enough that she could see a pale ring around his gray eyes. Abel looked at the bruise darkening above her collar. "What happened? Owen weighs more than he appears. You're hurt." "I'm functional." "That is not the same distinction you made at the river." "No," she said. "This one is for work." He stood. "Tomorrow you ride in the lead wagon. Tomas cooks breakfast." Mara stared at him. "Tomas burns water. Then we'll remember this storm for 2 reasons. I can work, I know." The answer came quietly. "That is why I am telling you to stop." She wanted to argue. The argument was already assembled, sharp and efficient. Then she saw what he was actually doing, not questioning her strength, accounting for it. The realization left her without a prepared response. Abel took his coffee and sat near the fire instead of walking away. Mara lowered herself onto the crate. The pain in her ribs throbbed. Around them, hail melted into the dirt. For once, she let someone else wash the pot. Tomas burned the first batch of coffee. Mara drank it anyway. She rode half the day in the lead wagon with a blanket folded behind her ribs and the ledger on her knees. Rest did not come naturally. It felt too much like surrendering information. From the wagon seat, she watched the train stretch behind them. 14 white canvas tops, 48 mules, 23 men. Every moving part depended on another part doing what it had been asked to do. A freight outfit was less like a line and more like a watch. Remove one pin, one spring, one tooth from a gear, and the whole machine might continue for a while before anyone understood it was already failing. Her father had taught her that. "Most breakage begins before the sound," he used to say. By the time a man hears the crack, the decision was made miles ago. Mara had thought of that after Caleb died. The boiler had been leaking at the lower seam for months. The owner knew. The foreman knew. Men had wrapped the pipe, tightened the valve, and kept working because stopping cost money. The explosion had happened in 1 second. The choice that caused it had lasted half a year. She did not tell Abel any of this, but he began to understand pieces. He saw the way she went still when steam rose too fast from a kettle. He noticed she never stood directly in front of the portable forge bellows. He noticed she checked rivets twice. He did not ask her to explain. His restraint became another thing she trusted and wished she did not. 3 days after the hailstorm, the land began to climb. The road narrowed along ridges where late snow hid in the northern shadows. Cottonwoods disappeared. Pine took their place. The air sharpened. They were still nearly 300 miles from Livingston, but the mountain freight route had begun. Abel changed the order of the wagons. The medicine load moved to the center. The heaviest wire wagons went ahead on climbs and behind on descents. Double teams were used where the grade steepened. Mara walked beside wagon 11 and listened. The repaired reach pole held. The iron plate did not shift. That small success pleased her more than it should have. Silas found her checking it at dusk. "You always touch things like they belong to you," he said. Mara stood. "No, I touch them like someone will be hurt if they fail. You like Hart thinking he needs you." The remark landed because part of it was aimed near the truth. She closed the ledger. "Abel needs anyone who does useful work. You call him Abel now. So do you, not the way you do." Mara looked at Silas fully. There were men who mistook attention for ownership. Men who believed if a woman had been seen by one man, every other man was entitled to discuss the terms. "You threw iron in my supper," she said. "You have mistaken my patience for an invitation to continue." Silas's jaw moved. He stepped closer. Mara did not step back. She held Caleb's hammer loosely at her side, not raised, not threatened, simply present. Silas saw it. Before either spoke, Abel's voice came from behind the wagon. Rusk, only the name. Silas turned. Abel stood 10 paces away, nothing dramatic in his posture, no hand near a gun, no public challenge, just certainty. Silas spat into the dirt and walked off. Mara looked at Abel. I had it handled. I know. Then why did you come over? Because handling something does not mean you should have to handle it alone. The words were plain. They struck harder than anything poetic could have. Mara opened the ledger and pretended to look at a page. Abel did not stay for gratitude. That helped. The next morning, Wagon 3's right front hub ran hot. Mara had noted it twice already. The wheelwright who assembled it had bored the box slightly off-center. Grease slowed the damage but could not remove it. She told Abel the wagon would need a new hub before the first major pass. Nearest shop, he asked. Fort Laramie if they have seasoned elm. We are not going back. I know. What can you do? Build one. He looked at the mountain road ahead. How long? 2 days if the wood is right. 4 if it fights. We do not have 4. Then we should hope for obedient wood. They found a stand of dry elm near a creek and made camp early. Mara selected a section straight enough for the grain to carry weight. She and Tomas cut it with a crosscut saw. The old hub was removed, measured, and split so she could study the failure. For 2 days the outfit moved around her work. She shaped the new hub with an adze and draw knife, drilled the spoke mortises, heated the iron box and drove it into the center while the wood was still warm enough to accept it. The work opened blisters under old calluses. It also made her feel like herself in a way cooking never had, not because cooking was lesser. Because iron and wheelwork belonged to the part of her life before the explosion, before every skill she possessed became something men remembered only when convenient. The freight hands watched. This time they did not pretend not to. Tomas turned the bellows. Owen carried water. An older driver named Frank Malloy showed her a brace bit he had saved since the war and asked if it would cut cleaner. Silas stayed away. On the second evening, Abel brought her supper. It was the stew she had prepared that morning, kept warm badly by Tomas. Mara sat on the ground beside the unfinished hub, too tired to stand. Abel handed her the plate. You missed both meals. I ate bread. That is not a meal. It has been considered one by most armies. You are not an army. Today I feel like the losing side of one. He sat on the log opposite her. The new hub rested between them, pale elm against the blackened tools. My father built the first wagon I ever owned, Abel said. Mara looked up. He was not a wheelwright. He continued. He was confident. Those are not interchangeable. What happened? The left wheel came off 6 miles from town. My mother was inside with a crock of peaches. I remember the peaches more clearly than the accident. Were they lost? Everyone. That explains you. What does it explain? Your seriousness. He smiled then. Not almost. Actually smiled. It changed his face enough to make Mara look back at the hub. My wife used to say the same thing, he said. The smile faded, but not painfully. What was her name? Mara asked. Sarah. He rubbed one thumb over the scar on his knuckle. She was better with people than I am, better with the children, better at knowing when silence had become punishment instead of peace. Mara listened. Abel continued in the low, careful way of someone who had not practiced saying these things. After she died, I kept the company running because the company was something I knew how to repair. The children were not. They are not broken machinery. I know that. But you tried to treat grief like a damaged axle. Yes, there was no defensiveness in the answer. Mara respected him for that. What happened to your hand? She asked. He looked at the scar. Ruth slammed the barn door. I put my fist through the panel instead of shouting at her. When? 6 months after Sarah died. Did it help? No. Did the door learn anything? No. Then perhaps you did. He looked at her for a long moment. I did. The hub was finished at dawn. They set the tire hot, then cooled it so the shrinking iron gripped the wood. Mara listened as the wheel turned under load. No knock, no scrape, no false note. It held. They lost 2 days and saved the wagon. Abel wrote the delay into his company book. Beside the entry he added, hub built on trail by M. Keene. Mara saw it only because the book lay open. She did not mention it, but that night she wrote the same date in her own ledger. The pass they needed was called Devil's Step on old maps and red knife by the drivers who had crossed it. Neither name improved it. The road climbed through a narrow cut above a river that ran white with snowmelt. On one side, pine and rock rose almost straight up. On the other, the ground dropped hard enough that a wagon leaving the track would not stop until the river. The grade was 5 miles of strain. Abel ordered every wagon lightened. Men carried crates by hand through the steepest sections. Teams were doubled. Wheels were blocked at every halt. By late afternoon, 11 wagons had crossed the high shelf. 3 remained below: the medicine wagon, the repair wagon, and wagon 4 loaded with wire and stove iron. Clouds lowered over the pass. Mara watched them collect against the ridge. "Snow," she said. Abel looked up. "It is May. The mountain is not using our calendar. How much time?" "Not enough." They moved the medicine wagon first. The mules climbed with their bellies low and traces stretched tight. Men pushed at the rear wheels. Mara walked beside the right brake, one hand on the lever. Halfway up, she smelled hot wood. "Stop!" The driver hauled the reins. The wagon rolled back 6 inches before the chocks caught. Mara dropped to the wheel. Smoke curled from the brake block. The iron shoe had shifted and was cutting into the wheel rim at an angle. Silas, helping at the rear, swore, "We can't sit here. We move. We destroy the wheel. We sit. Snow closes the shelf." Mara touched the hub. Too hot. She looked beneath the wagon and saw the deeper problem. The new brake chain had been attached to an old eye-bolt. The bolt was pulling through the frame. "How long?" Abel asked. "To fix it properly." "An hour. We have 20 minutes. Then I can make it wrong in a way that holds." Silas barked a laugh. "That is your answer?" Mara turned on him. "It is the honest answer." Abel crouched beside her. "Tell me." "We move the brake chain to the rear bolster, wrap it through both frame rails, and add a drag shoe under the wheel. It will scar the timber. It may ruin the chain, but the load stays on the road." "What do you need?" "Chain, 2 clevises, the short pry bar, and everyone who can pull." The snow began as hard white grains. They worked beneath the wagon while the storm closed around them. Mara threaded chain through the frame. Abel held the weight off the rail. Tomas drove the clevis pin with a hammer. Silas was ordered to bring the drag shoe. He returned without it. "Couldn't find it." "It is behind the left repair chest," Mara said. "Not there. I put it there this morning." Abel looked at him. Silas looked back too long. Mara understood before either man spoke. He had moved it, perhaps as a joke, perhaps to make her look disorganized, perhaps because some men would rather damage an entire outfit than allow one woman's competence to stand unchallenged. "Where?" Abel asked. Silas shrugged. "Maybe it fell." The first heavy flakes crossed the road. Abel stood. His voice went so quiet the wind seemed loud around it. "Where is the shoe?" Silas's face changed. "Repair wagon," he muttered. "Under the coal sacks." The repair wagon was half a mile below. There was no time. Mara looked at the slope, the load, the whitening road. Then she crawled beneath wagon 4 and pulled free one of the flat iron stove braces lashed under the bed. "This will do." "That is inventory," Silas said. Mara stared at him. "So is the medicine. Choose which one you want at the bottom of the river." She bent the brace cold against the wagon step, wrapped it in rawhide and chained it beneath the wheel. It was ugly. It was temporary. It held. The medicine wagon reached the shelf as snow covered the tracks behind it. Then the mountain made its next decision. A crack sounded above them, not thunder, rock. A section of wet slope broke loose where snowmelt had softened the earth. Stones and mud spilled across the road between wagon 4 and the others. The lead team bolted. The driver lost the reins. Wagon 4 rolled backward. Abel was behind it, helping at the wheel. Mara saw him slip, saw one leg go under the rear axle, saw the wagon begin to come down on him. Everything after that happened inside a few seconds. She seized the brake chain with both hands. The links tore skin from her palms. She threw her weight backward and screamed for Tomas to block the wheel. Tomas missed. The drag shoe folded. The wagon moved another foot. Abel's shoulder struck the ground. His face went white. Mara saw the portable forge chain hanging from the repair mule's saddle. She let go with one hand, caught it, and looped it around the nearest pine trunk. "Pull the slack!" she shouted. Owen and Frank Malloy grabbed the free end. The wagon rolled again. The chain snapped tight. The pine bent. The rear wheel stopped less than the width of Mara's hand from Abel's chest. No one moved. Then Abel said through clenched teeth, "Get it off me." The men lifted the axle with pry bars. Mara crawled into the mud and dragged him clear. The moment his body was free, the pine root tore loose. The wagon slid 3 feet, struck the rockfall, and tipped onto its side. Crates burst open. Iron spilled across the road. But Abel was alive. Mara knelt over him in the snow. His left leg lay at a bad angle. Blood ran from his temple. He opened his eyes. "You were right," he said faintly. "About what?" "The mountain not reading calendars." Then he lost consciousness. Mara pressed 2 fingers to his throat. Pulse, fast, strong enough. She looked up at the men standing in the storm. "Do not stand there," she said. "We need a litter. We need the medicine wagon emptied enough to carry him. And someone tie Silas Rusk to a mule before I decide the weather is not our greatest problem." No one laughed. They moved. They made the high shelf after dark. The snow deepened to 4 inches. Mara set Abel's leg between 2 split boards padded with folded blankets. She cleaned the wound at his temple, checked his pupils, and forced him to drink water each time he woke. He had broken nothing that she could feel, but the knee was badly twisted and the lower leg swelling fast. The medicine crates sat around him in the wagon bed, 3 cases of quinine for a town fighting fever, 1 injured man who owned the outfit, and 13 miles of mountain road before the next shelter. Abel woke near midnight. "Wagons?" he asked. 12 upright, 1 tipped, 1 below the slide. Plow, medicine intact, half the stove iron scattered, wire wagon safe, animals, 1 mule cut, none lost, Rusk tied to a mule. He closed his eyes. That was not an order. No, it was a precaution. A weak breath of laughter moved through him and turned into pain. Mara adjusted the blanket under his leg. "You are done leading for a while? Malloy can take the front. He already has." Abel opened his eyes again. "You decided that?" "Yes." "Good." It was the first time he gave her authority without asking what she intended to do with it. The weight of it settled immediately. Mara did not romanticize command. Command meant the next mistake belonged partly to you, even if someone else made it. She climbed down from the wagon and stood with Frank Malloy over the ledger. They had enough grain for the teams if they cut the animals' evening ration by 1/4. The men had food for 9 days at normal use, 12 if Mara stretched it. The slide might take half a day to clear. The tipped wagon could be salvaged. The wagon below the obstruction would need to wait unless they found a second route. The doctor's settlement lay 5 days north in fair weather. This was not fair weather. "We leave the stove iron," Mara said. Frank frowned. "Paid freight. Quinine is paid freight too. Hart decides what gets abandoned. Hart cannot stand." Frank looked toward the wagon. Mara held his gaze. "The iron stoves can be replaced next season. The medicine cannot arrive after the people who need it are buried." He looked at the snow, then at the scattered cargo. "All right." They recovered the food, the coal, the tools, and what wire could be carried. The rest was stacked beneath canvas near the rock wall and marked in Abel's company book. At dawn, Mara cut Silas loose. His wrists were red where the rope had rubbed. He glared at her. "You enjoyed that." "No, you made me look like a thief. You hid equipment on a mountain road. It was a joke." Mara stepped closer. Behind her, men were hitching teams. No one spoke, but several listened. "A joke ends when the person telling it stops," she said. "What you did continued into a storm. It cost time. It forced us to break freight. It put every wagon on that grade at greater risk." Silas looked toward Abel's wagon. "I didn't cause the slide. No, you only made sure we met it less prepared." His eyes hardened. "You think Hart will choose you over a man who has driven for him 7 years?" Mara looked at the rope burns on his wrists. He already chose the outfit. She handed him the lead of the injured mule. "You walk today." Silas opened his mouth. Frank Malloy spoke from the harness line. "You walk, Rusk." That ended it. The snow stopped by noon. The cold remained. Mara rode beside Abel's wagon while the train descended the northern side of the pass. Each jolt brought pain across his face, though he made almost no sound. Near sunset, he woke and found her checking the splint. "You took the stoves off the list," he said. Mara looked at him. "Frank told you? I saw the book. You disagree?" "No, you paid for them. I pay for mistakes too. That one was mine." "Was it?" "You would have chosen the medicine, yes." "Then why ask?" "Because I wanted to know whether you understood the cost." Mara tightened the blanket. "I understood it. I know." He watched her hands. The chain had torn both palms. She had wrapped them in linen, but blood had seeped through. "You caught the wagon," he said. 6 people caught it. You saw the chain. Yes, you tied it. Yes, you pulled me out. Yes. His eyes closed again. "Mara, what?" "Thank you." She went still. Gratitude was simple when it came from a stranger. From him it carried every morning by the fire, every unasked question, every time he had treated her judgment as a fact worth using. She looked away toward the road. "Stay alive long enough to make it inconvenient," she said. "I will try." The settlement of Elk Crossing appeared 6 days later. It was less a town than a group of stubborn buildings arranged around a sawmill and a church. Smoke lay low over the roofs. A yellow flag hung from the doctor's porch. Fever. The 3 medicine crates were unloaded before the freight men found beds. Dr. Wynne broke the seals with a pry bar in the street. He was gray with exhaustion and had not shaved in days. "You are late," he said. Abel, sitting on the wagon seat with his injured leg braced, answered, "We brought all of it." The doctor looked at the snow-caked wagons. "How?" Abel pointed to Mara. "She kept it dry. Kept it moving. Left stove iron in the past to make room." Dr. Wynne turned to her. "How much quinine?" 72 bottles, 12 fever powders, 4 pounds of willow bark. The third crate has clean linen and 2 glass syringes." He stared. "You memorized the manifest?" "I packed around it for 6 weeks. The doctor gripped the edge of the crate. "Mrs. Keene, there are 19 people sick. 7 are children. I have been splitting the last bottle into doses too small to matter." His voice broke only slightly. "This arrived in time." For months, Mara had measured her usefulness and avoided damage. A wheel that did not fail, a mule that did not lame, food that did not spoil. Now the proof stood in front of her as a doctor carrying bottles into a building where children waited. The work had crossed the distance between prevention and consequence. She felt it. She also understood that feeling it too deeply would make her cry in the street. So she turned and ordered Owen to cover the remaining freight before the evening frost. That night the town fed the drivers. Silas sat alone near the stable wall. Abel sent Frank Malloy to tell him his employment ended at Elk Crossing. He would receive wages through the day and no recommendation. Silas came to the room where Mara was wrapping Abel's knee. He stood in the doorway. "I suppose this is what you wanted." Mara did not rise. Abel did, or tried to. Pain stopped him halfway. Mara put one hand on his shoulder and kept her eyes on Silas. "No," she said. "I wanted you to stop before your pride became somebody else's funeral." Silas's face flushed. "You think you're better than me." "I think better is something a person has to keep proving." He looked at Abel. "You're firing me for a piece of iron." Abel's voice was quiet. "I'm firing you because when the road became dangerous, you chose to make the people around you weaker." Silas waited for an argument he could win. There was none. He left the next morning on a stagecoach headed south. Mara watched only long enough to be sure he was gone. Abel's knee improved slowly. Dr. Wynne ordered him off horseback for 2 weeks. The freight train had another 180 miles to Livingston, and the delay would consume the profit on half the remaining cargo. Abel sat at a table in the boarding house with his company book open. Mara stood by the window. "You should send the wagons without you," she said. "I will. Frank can lead. I know. You are disagreeing silently. I am calculating. That is disagreement with a pencil." He put the pencil down. "I want you to go with them. As cook?" "No." The word came immediately. "As what then?" Abel looked at the ledger between them. "Roadmaster." Mara almost laughed. "I have never been a roadmaster. You have been doing the work since Nebraska. I repaired wagons. You changed load order, rationed teams, kept the medicine protected, chose what freight to abandon, and brought 12 wagons through Red Knife after I became cargo. You were difficult cargo. Still cargo." She looked at the company book. "A roadmaster is paid $35 a month. That is what I am offering. Frank will object." Frank suggested it. That surprised her enough to show. Abel saw. "He said you hear trouble before the rest of us hear noise." Mara looked down at her bandaged palms. "What happens when we reach Livingston?" "I would like you to stay." The room became very quiet. He did not rush the next words. "I own a freight yard there. A repair shop, though calling it a shop is generous. The man running it can shoe mules and ruin wheels. I need someone who knows the difference. You need a smith. I need you." She raised her eyes. He held her gaze without softening the sentence or hiding behind business. Then he added, "At wages, with your own quarters, your own books. No obligation beyond the work." The care in that last line mattered. He was offering a place without trying to purchase the rest of her life with it. Mara leaned against the window frame. "You have children." "Yes, they may not want me near their home. The freight yard is in town. The ranch is 6 miles out. You would not have to live with us. You have thought this through. For 6 days, while feverish. Mostly while you were ordering men twice your age off broken wagons." She looked out at Elk Crossings. The settlement was rough, temporary, and full of people who had arrived because somewhere else had closed behind them. She knew that condition. "What do you want from me that is not work?" she asked. Abel's face changed very slightly. "Honesty. That is expensive, I know. And what are you offering that is not wages?" "The same." Mara let the silence stay. She thought of Junction City, the rented room. Caleb's hammer wrapped in cloth. The wheel shops that knew her skill and would not put it on payroll. Then she thought of the company book, M. Keene, written in Abel's hand beside work that it held. "I will take the roadmaster position," she said. His shoulders eased. "I have not answered the rest. I did not ask the rest." "No," she said, "you didn't." That was one more reason she went north. Mara led the wagons out of Elk Crossing with Frank Malloy beside her. Abel remained behind until Dr. Wynne cleared him to travel. For the first 2 days, every decision felt too visible. Men waited to see whether she would become louder now that she had authority, whether she would imitate Abel, whether fear had been the only thing making her careful. She did none of those things. She checked the teams. She changed the order of 2 wagons. She cut the noon halt short before rain softened the road. When Owen forgot to set both wheel blocks on a slope, she made him run back and do it again. She did not humiliate him. She did not rescue him from remembering. By the 3rd day, the train moved under her hand the way it had under Abel's. Not because she became him, because the road responded to attention no matter who was giving it. They reached Livingston with 13 wagons, 46 mules, every medicine receipt signed, and the new Elm hub still running cool. The freight yard occupied half a block near the rail spur. It had a long shed, 2 corrals, a scale house, and a repair building with one wall leaning away from the roof. The forge chimney drew badly. Tools were scattered by habit instead of purpose. 3 wagon wheels weighted against the wall, all repaired incorrectly. Mara walked through once, then again. The man Abel had called a smith was named Merton Dale. He watched her examine a wheel and said, "Women usually keep the account book." Mara tapped the rim with her hammer. The wheel answered with a dead note. "Then usually this tire comes off in 20 miles. Merton folded his arms. "That wheel is done." Mara pointed to the second spoke from the valve mark. "Strike it." He did. The spoke moved in the mortise. His face changed. Mara took Caleb's hammer from her apron, removed the tire, reset the spokes. "Heat the rim evenly this time. Who put you in charge?" Abel's voice came from the doorway. "I did." He stood on a cane, thinner from the injury, his left leg still stiff. Behind him were 2 children. Ruth was tall for 11, brown-haired, straight-backed, and carrying a ring of keys at her waist as if she expected a pantry to require defense at any moment. Ben was smaller, dark-eyed, and scowling at the world with professional commitment. Mara had imagined this meeting several times on the road. None of the imagined versions included a loose wagon dog charging from under the workbench. The animal barked. Ben startled backward into a bucket of quench water. The bucket overturned. Merton swore. Ruth grabbed Ben's sleeve. Mara caught the rolling bucket with her boot before it reached the coal bin. For one ridiculous second, all 5 of them stood in silence. Then Ben looked at her hammer. "Is that yours?" "Yes." "Father says you stopped a wagon with a tree." 6 people and a chain stopped a wagon with a tree. "He says you thought of it." "I did." Ben studied her. "Can you make a knife?" "Yes." "Will you?" "No." His scowl deepened. "Why not?" "Because you asked before saying hello." Ruth made a small sound that might have been a laugh and immediately hid it. Ben looked offended. Then, after thinking, he said, "Hello, Mrs. Keene." "Hello, Ben. Can you make a knife?" "Not today." He considered this answer more seriously than the refusal. Ruth held out the key ring. "I keep the house accounts, so I heard. Father loses receipts." "I heard that too." Abel behind them said, "This has become an organized attack." Ruth looked at Mara. "Do you keep receipts?" "Yes." "Where?" "By date, freight number, and who will lie about receiving them later." Ruth's face opened by 1 degree. That was the beginning. Mara took rooms above the freight office. She repaired the forge chimney, reset the anvil, inventoried every tool, and dismissed Merton Dale after he ruined a second wheel and blamed the wood. Frank Malloy found her a young apprentice named Lewis who listened more than he spoke. Business improved because sound work returned customers. By autumn, the repair shop was taking in wheels from 3 counties. Ranchers brought plowshares, hinges, axles, and broken hay rake teeth. Mara charged clearly, wrote every job in the ledger, and refused to promise dates she could not keep. Abel came to town most mornings, sometimes on company business, sometimes not. His knee healed enough for riding, though cold weather made him limp. He and Mara still had coffee before the day began. The location changed from a trail fire to the freight office stove, but the quiet between them held. Ruth visited twice a week to help with accounts. She checked Mara's columns for errors. Once she found one. Mara thanked her. Ruth stared as if adults were not supposed to do that. Ben came whenever he could escape chores. He wanted the knife. Mara made him earn each stage of it by learning the tools. First, he swept scale. Then he turned the grindstone. Then he learned why hot iron looked duller in sunlight and why that could burn a careless hand. He complained constantly and missed nothing. Mara did not attempt to become their mother. Sarah Hart had existed. She had loved them. She belonged to the house, the stories, the shape of Abel's face when he said her name. Mara did not need that place. She needed to know whether another place could be built beside it. The answer came in pieces. Ruth began leaving the freight receipts in Mara's office without waiting to be invited. Ben stopped asking when Mara would leave town. Abel stopped pretending every visit was about wagons. In November, the first hard freeze split a water pipe at the ranch. Abel arrived at the yard before dawn. Mara looked at the ice on his coat. "What happened?" "Kitchen line burst. Cellar is flooding." She was already reaching for tools. At the ranch, water poured through a cracked joint behind the stove. The floor was slick. Ruth stood on a chair moving sacks of flour to the table. Ben carried jars from the lower shelves. Mara shut the line, opened the drain, and crawled beneath the floor with a lantern. The pipe had been fitted with a thin collar that winter cold had finally opened. She could replace it. What mattered more was what she heard under the house. A repeated soft creak, wood moving under load. She held the lantern closer. One of the main floor beams was black with rot where years of leaks had soaked it. "Abel," she called. He crouched at the opening. "What? Get everyone out of the kitchen. The pipe, the beam." Ruth started to protest about the flour. Mara's voice sharpened. "Now." They cleared the room. 10 minutes later, the beam split. The center of the kitchen floor dropped 6 inches and the stove tilted hard enough to pull its chimney pipe loose. Ash filled the room. No one was standing there. Abel looked through the doorway at the broken floor, then at Mara. "Before the sound," he said. She turned toward him. "What? You said breakage begins before the sound." Mara had told him that only once, weeks earlier, near the mountain road, he remembered. Yes. He looked at the place where Ruth had been standing. "Then we rebuild." They did. Not just the beam, the kitchen, the water line, the rotten section of sill. Mara designed an iron brace for the stove and a shut-off valve Ruth could reach without crawling under the floor. Ben carried nails. Ruth kept a list of materials and challenged the lumber bill. The work took 6 days. On the 7th, they ate supper in the repaired kitchen. Mara had not planned to stay. Snow began after dark, thick and windless. The road to town would be difficult by midnight. Abel set a lamp in the spare room without asking whether she needed it. Ruth placed a folded nightdress on the bed. Ben left the unfinished knife on the table beside the lamp, an obvious attempt to ensure she did not disappear before morning. Mara stood in the doorway of the room. She understood the arrangement. No one had said stay. All three had prepared for it. She slept badly because the house made unfamiliar sounds. Near 2 in the morning, she woke to footsteps in the hall. Ruth stood outside the door. The girl wore a blanket over her shoulders. "Ben is asleep," she said. "All right." "Father is asleep too." "All right." Ruth looked at the floor. When Mother died, people kept saying things would settle. Mara waited. They did not say what they would settle into. "No." "Do you know?" "No." Ruth looked up, angry at and relieved by it. Mara continued. "I know that when iron cools, it keeps the shape made while it was hot. People are not iron. We change again. Sometimes that is the trouble. Sometimes it is the mercy." Ruth pulled the blanket tighter. "Are you going to marry Father?" There was no point pretending she had not considered it. "I do not know. Does he?" "No." "Ben thinks you will. Ben thinks I will make him a knife with a silver handle. He has poor judgment. He is 8. That is what I said." Mara smiled. Ruth saw it and almost smiled back. Then she said, "If you do, you should know Father goes silent when he is frightened." "I know. He thinks it looks calm. I know that too." Ruth nodded, satisfied that the warning had been delivered. She turned toward her room. "Ruth," the girl stopped. "I am not trying to take your mother's place." Ruth did not look back. "I know," she said. "That is why there might be room," Abel asked Mara in January. "Not at the ranch, not beside a sunset. In the repair shop, while sleet struck the windows and Lewis had gone to deliver a wheel, Mara was filing a new brake shoe when Abel placed a document on the bench. It was a partnership agreement, half the repair business, 1/3 of the freight company's net profit after wages and losses. Her name written in full, Mara Keene. She read every line. "You had a lawyer write this," she said. "Yes, you argued with him for 3 days." "About what?" "He believed a woman's interest should pass to her husband." Mara looked up. "And I told him that was not the agreement." Something moved through her chest, not softness. Something stronger, recognition. Abel rested both hands on the bench. "I want to marry you," he said, "but I do not want the marriage to become the reason your work belongs to me." The sleet tapped the glass. Mara looked back at the paper. "You are making this difficult to refuse." "I am trying to make it honest to accept." She put down the file. "What do you think marriage with me will be?" "Work." "That is not romantic." I was not finished. He took a breath. "Work. Argument. Coffee before anyone else wakes. 2 children who will test every promise. A freight company that may fail in a bad year. A ranch that needs more money than it admits. Your hammer on the table. My boots where you told me not to leave them." A small smile touched her mouth. He continued. "Some grief, some peace, enough truth to make both possible." Mara looked at him for a long time. "What about love?" she asked. Abel's voice lowered. "I thought naming it first might make the rest sound smaller." She felt the answer all the way down. He did not reach for her. He waited. Mara had spent nearly 2 years living after an explosion. She had believed survival meant staying light enough to move before the next thing broke, but she knew now that there was another kind of strength. Not the strength of carrying less, the strength of building carefully enough that weight could be shared. She touched the partnership paper. "I will sign this whether I marry you or not." "Yes. And if I marry you, the shop remains mine too." "Yes. And Ruth keeps the pantry keys until she chooses otherwise." "Yes. And Ben gets no silver-handled knife." "Agreed." Mara took Caleb's hammer from her apron and set it on the contract to keep the paper flat. Then she looked at Abel. Yes, he closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them, the controlled man was still there. So was everything beneath him. He held out his hand. Mara took it. This time, neither of them pretended it was business. They married in March after the roads opened. Ruth stood beside Mara. Ben carried the rings and nearly dropped one through a crack in the church floor. Frank Malloy signed as witness. Dr. Wynne sent a bottle of quinine wrapped in paper with a note that said, "For the next crisis, though I hope you choose a smaller one." Mara kept her rooms above the office for another year and used them whenever winter work ran late. She kept the repair books under her own name. When invoices went out, they read Hart and Keene Freight va Iron. Over the next 12 years, the company crossed Red Knife Pass 31 more times. They never lost a medicine wagon. Mara's shop built replacement hubs, snow brakes, reinforced reach poles, and a new locking chain system copied by 3 other freight outfits. Ruth eventually took over company accounts and removed more waste in one season than Abel had found in 10 years. Ben became a wheelwright, though he told everyone he chose the trade independently. The knife Mara made him at 15 had a plain bone handle. He called it perfect. Mara never stopped missing Caleb. She stopped mistaking that for a reason not to love what came after him. There were hard years. A flood took 1 corral. A winter killed 17 head of cattle. One freight contract failed and cost them nearly all the profit from a season. Abel still went silent when frightened. Mara still worked past the point where asking for help would have been sensible. They learned to name both habits before they became damage. That was their form of tenderness. Not rescue, maintenance, attention before the crack. On the 20th anniversary of the Red Knife crossing, Ben found the old broken shackle in a box at the back of the shop. Mara had kept it without knowing why. He turned it over in his hands. "This is the piece Rusk threw in your stew?" "Yes, you should have hit him with it." I considered several improvements to his character. Ben laughed. Then he studied the pale, grainy break. "You could see all that from this?" "Not all of it. What could you see?" Mara took the shackle. Outside, wagon wheels moved through the freight yard. A hammer rang from the forge. Ruth's voice carried from the office as she corrected someone's arithmetic. Abel sat near the open door with one stiff leg stretched toward the sun. Mara ran her thumb over the old fracture. "I could see it had been failing for a long time," she said. "And nobody noticed?" "They noticed the sound when it finally broke." She placed the iron on the bench. "That is how most things are lost." Then she looked across the yard at the life built from every warning they had chosen not to ignore, and how some things are saved.